You were never a real father to me. You were just the man who wrote the checks." My son said those words on a Tuesday afternoon in October, standing in the same kitchen where I'd taught him to make scrambled eggs after his mother died. He was 37 years old. He said it like he'd been saving it up, like he'd been sharpening it in some dark corner of himself for years, and had finally decided it was time to use it. I didn't answer him. I didn't move. I just sat there at that table with my coffee going cold between my hands and looked at this man I had poured my entire life into. And I felt something shift inside me that I knew, with absolute certainty, would never shift back. It had started the way a lot of the worst conversations start, calmly. My son and his wife had driven the 40 minutes from their side of Columbus to have what she had called a family discussion. She'd used those exact words in her text message. Family discussion. I remember reading it and thinking the phrasing was odd, too formal, like something you'd find in a corporate memo. But I'd set out the good coffee and a plate of those shortbread cookies my daughter-in-law always claimed to love, and I'd told myself to keep an open mind. My son's wife came in first. She always did. She had a way of entering a room like she was claiming it, her eyes moving quickly to assess everything before her expression settled into something warm and practiced. She hugged me and said I looked great, which was the thing she said when she wanted something. My son came in behind her, and I noticed right away that he wasn't quite meeting my eyes. He did that when he was uncomfortable, had done it since he was a boy. When he broke the neighbor's window with a baseball at age 9, he'd spent 2 full days studying the floor. I recognized the posture. We sat down. My son's wife did most of the talking at first. She explained that they were in a difficult position financially. The mortgage had adjusted, the rate was brutal, the kids' school tuition had gone up for the 3rd year running. She laid it out with the practiced patience of someone who had rehearsed this presentation, and I listened, and I nodded, and I waited. Then she got to the point. She wanted me to sign my property over into a joint trust. My house, my land out on Route 9 where I'd been planning to build a small rental unit when I retired. All of it rolled into a shared asset that she and my son could use to refinance their debt at a lower rate. She had a folder, printed pages with highlighted sections. She slid it across the table toward me like a real estate agent closing a deal. I picked it up. I read it carefully. Then I set it down. I told them I should talk about their monthly expenses before we talked about restructuring my assets. I told them that I'd been helping with their mortgage for almost 4 years, close to $900 a month, and I'd been glad to do it, but that I was worried the underlying problem wasn't the interest rate. I asked them, as gently as I knew how, whether they had sat down recently and looked at where everything was actually going. My son's wife went quiet in a very specific way, the kind of quiet that isn't peace but pressure. She set her coffee cup down without drinking from it. "Harold," she said, "we didn't come here for a lecture." I told her I wasn't lecturing. I was asking a question. "You always do this," she said. "Every time we need your support, you turn it into some kind of performance review. We're your family, not one of your job sites." I tried again. I said I loved them. I said I wanted to help. I said that was exactly why I was suggesting we look at the full picture before making any decisions about my property. That's when my son stood up. I'd seen my son angry before. He had his mother's eyes and his grandfather's temper, and when those two things combined, it could fill a room. But this was different. This wasn't the flash of hot emotion I recognized from 25 years of raising him. This was something slower, something that had been sitting under the surface for a long time. "You know what your problem is?" he said. "You've always thought you were the smartest person in every room. You built your little business, you paid your bills, and ever since Mom died, you've acted like that gave you the right to judge every decision I've ever made." I started to answer, but he wasn't finished. "I spent my whole childhood watching you work. Every weekend, every holiday. You were always on a job site, always on the phone, always too busy to actually be present. And then you want to sit here and tell me about financial responsibility?" His voice was shaking now, but not with grief, with something harder. "You think writing checks makes you a father? You think paying for things is the same as showing up?" "Son," I said quietly, "don't call me that." He was looking straight at me now, and his wife had gone very still beside him. watching. You were never a real father to me. You were just the man who wrote the checks. The room went absolutely silent. I looked at my son's face. I looked at my son's wife's face. And what I saw in her expression was not discomfort or surprise. It was the faintest trace of satisfaction, the stillness of someone watching a plan land exactly where they'd aimed it. I stood up. I walked to the counter, poured the rest of my coffee down the drain, and set the mug in the sink with great care. "All right," I said. "Then I'll stop writing them." My son blinked. "What? If writing checks is all I've ever been to you, then there's no sense in continuing the arrangement." I turned around and faced them both. My voice was very calm. I was surprised by how calm it was. "The mortgage assistance ends today. The car insurance I've been covering for your wife ends at the end of the month. The account I set up for the kids' tuition, I'll redirect that to a separate fund in their names that neither of you can access until they're 18. My son's wife stood up slowly. "Harold, you're being ridiculous." "I'm being accurate," I said. "Your husband just told me I was never a real father. I'm choosing to agree with him. Fathers have obligations. Men who just write checks do not. This is insane." My son ran his hand through his hair. I was venting. I was frustrated. "You can't just... I think you should both go home now." I picked up the folder she'd brought and held it out to her. "I won't be signing this." She took it without looking at me, and something moved across her face that was very far from the warmth she'd walked in with. My son stood there for another moment, as if he expected me to take it back, to soften, to be the man who always eventually came around. When I didn't, he followed his wife to the door. I watched their car back out of my driveway from the kitchen window. Then I sat back down at the table in the quiet, and I let the full weight of what had just happened settle over me. 25 years. Lena had died of ovarian cancer in February of his 12th year, and from that day forward I had reorganized every corner of my life around making sure our son didn't lose more than he'd already lost. I'd turned down contracts that would have required travel. I'd coached his little league team, even though I barely understood the infield fly rule. I'd sat through every school conference, every rough patch, every bad girlfriend, every moment of a young man finding his footing, and I'd done it while running a business alone and grieving a wife I had loved more than I knew how to say. I thought about the first year after Lena died, when my son would come into my room at 2 a.m. and just sit on the floor beside my bed because neither of us could sleep. I hadn't written a check for that. I'd just been there. But that wasn't what he remembered, apparently. Or maybe it wasn't what she'd allowed him to remember. I picked up my phone and called Pete Dawson. Pete was 39, my son's business partner and one of the few people connected to my son's life that I'd trusted consistently. His father, Frank, had worked for me for 15 years before retiring, and Pete had grown up in and out of my house the same way my son had grown up in and out of theirs. He answered on the third ring. I told him what had happened. Not all of it, but enough. Pete was quiet for a moment, and then he said, "Harold, I have to tell you something. I've been trying to figure out how to bring this up for about 2 months." I told him to go ahead. "Brianna has been talking to a real estate attorney," Pete said carefully. "Not about your property specifically, at least not that I know of. But she has been looking into what it would take to have you declared financially incompetent. Something about how you've been making unusual decisions with your money." There was a pause. I didn't know how to tell Connor without it turning into a whole thing. You know how he gets when it comes to her. I did know. I thanked Pete and told him I'd be in touch. I sat in my kitchen for a long time after that. The afternoon light moved across the floor the way it did in late October, low and flat and golden, and I thought about the word incompetent and what it would have taken to put that idea in motion. Someone would have had to plant it, tend it, make it seem reasonable. That kind of thinking didn't arrive on its own. The next morning I called my attorney. Then I called my bank. Then I spent 2 hours on the phone with my accountant going through every transaction from the past 6 years, and I made a list. It was a long list. Mortgage assistance, close to $44,000 over 4 years. Car payments, insurance. The emergency loan when my son's HVAC company lost a major contract 3 years ago. The down payment I'd helped with on their house before the list went on. The total was larger than I'd fully reckoned with while I was living inside it, and seeing it laid out in black and white produced a feeling I hadn't expected. Not anger, something colder and more clarifying than anger. I also made a second call to my attorney, a different kind of call, about updating certain documents. On Thursday, my neighbor Diane appeared at my back door with a pan of lasagna, and the particular expression she wore when she was delivering sympathy with information attached. She'd heard, she said. The whole street had heard. She was so sorry. She'd always thought my son's wife was a bit much, but she'd never wanted to say anything because it wasn't her place. But honestly, I thanked her for the lasagna and let her talk for 12 minutes by the kitchen clock. On Friday, my old friend Frank Colton came by without calling ahead, which was how Frank operated when something was serious. He sat down across from me with his coat still on and said, "You doing okay, Harry?" I told him I was doing fine. "Pete told me some of it," Frank said. "Not all of it, but some." He looked at me steadily. "That boy of yours has got his head turned around. I've been watching it happen for 6 years and I didn't say a damn word, and I'm sorry for that." I asked him what he'd seen. Frank thought about it for a moment, the way he always did when he wanted to make sure he was being fair. "She isolates," he said finally. "Subtle like. She doesn't make scenes. She just slowly creates a version of events where the people who love him most are the people standing in the way of his happiness. Over enough years, it sticks." He paused. "My son's worried about the business. She's been pushing Connor to buy her out of a side project they did together, but the numbers don't add up right. Pete doesn't want to accuse her of anything without knowing more." I told Frank about the financial incompetency conversation Pete had mentioned. Frank's jaw tightened. "Lord Almighty," he said quietly. We sat with that for a minute. "I'm not going to chase him," I said. "I want to be clear about that. I'm not going to beg my son to believe what he knows in his bones, if he's decided he'd rather believe something else." Frank nodded slowly. "I know, but Pete's going to keep his eyes open. And I'm telling you, Harry, when the thing breaks, it's going to break fast." He was right. It took 11 days. My son showed up on a Saturday morning without his wife. He rang the doorbell, which he hadn't done since he was a teenager, and when I opened the door, he looked like a man who had spent a week not sleeping. His eyes were red at the rims. He was wearing a jacket that didn't match his pants, which for my son, who had been careful about his appearance since his early 20s, meant something was genuinely wrong. I let him in. I put on coffee. He sat down at the kitchen table, and for a while, neither of us said anything. Then he started talking. "Dad," he said, and the word hung in the air between us. "I need you to know that what I said last week, He stopped. "Tried again. I don't actually believe that." I looked at him and waited. Pete found something. He folded his hands on the table, unfolded them, folded them again. "In the business accounts. Money that's been moved around in a way that doesn't make sense. Small amounts, but consistently, over about 2 years. And the attorney she's been consulting, Dad, it's not just about your property. She's been asking about divorce law, asset protection, how you structure a split when one partner has significantly more holdings." He said the last part like it hurt his mouth. I poured 2 cups of coffee and set one in front of him. "How long have you known?" I asked. "Pete came to me 4 days ago with the account stuff. The attorney thing, I only found out about yesterday. I found a folder in her car." He looked up at me, and I could see the specific pain of a man whose map of his own life has just been redrawn without his permission. "Dad, I don't know how long this has been going on. I don't know what's real and what isn't. I feel like I've been walking around in a house where someone's been quietly rearranging the furniture for years, and I just kept bumping into things and blaming myself for being clumsy." I told him I understood that feeling. "What I said to you." He shook his head. "I've been going back over the last 6 years trying to figure out where that even came from. Because it's not what I think. It's genuinely not. And I keep remembering these conversations with Brianna, spread out over years, where she'd say things like, 'Your dad has always had to be the one in control,' or, 'Don't you think it's strange that he always attaches conditions to his help?' Just small things. Things that sounded reasonable at the time. And I think..." He trailed off. "You think she was building something?" I said. Yeah. His voice was barely above a whisper. I think she was building something. I drank my coffee. I looked at my son, this man who had come into my room at 2 in the morning when he was 12 years old because the world had taken his mother and the dark was too big to handle alone. And I felt something that was complicated and real and not easily named. I need you to understand something, I said carefully. I believe that you're sorry. I believe that you're telling me the truth right now. But what happened in this kitchen 10 days ago is not something I can simply set aside. You said what you said. Whatever she planted, you still chose to use it. He flinched. I'm not your enemy, I continued. I'm not interested in punishing you. But I need you to understand that my response wasn't a tantrum. It wasn't dramatic. I made decisions about my own life based on information you gave me, and those decisions stand until I decide otherwise. He nodded, slowly. I know. I'm not asking you to fix everything today. I'm asking if we can fix us, at whatever pace that takes. I told him I thought we could, and I meant it. But I also told him there was something we needed to do first. My son looked at me. I need to have a conversation with your wife, I said. You, me, and her. In this house, and this time, the truth comes out. All of it. He was quiet for a long time. Then he said, She won't come willingly. Then you need to decide, I said, whether you're going to make her. He drove home that afternoon, and I sat with the uncertainty of not knowing which way he'd land. I had laid out the terms as plainly as I knew how. What he did with them was his. My daughter-in-law called me herself that evening. Harold, she said, her voice carrying the particular tone she used when she was performing reasonableness. I think there's been a lot of misunderstanding on all sides. I want to clear the air. I told her Sunday afternoon at 2 o'clock worked fine. She arrived early. I noticed that first. She was sitting in my driveway at 1:45, which told me she wanted the advantage of being settled before anyone else. My son pulled in at 2 on the dot, and I watched through the front window as they walked to the door separately, the small but unmistakable distance of two people who had been in a significant argument and had not resolved it. I opened the door before either of them could knock. We sat in the living room, this time, not the kitchen. I had set 3 chairs at careful angles, no folder on the coffee table, no cookies. My son's wife noticed the absence. I want to start by saying, she began, that I understand feelings were hurt. Connor was out of line in what he said to you, and I think he's told you that. She glanced at my son, who was studying the middle distance. I also think you've been very reactive in a way that's caused real harm to your grandchildren. Pulling their tuition account, cutting off support without any warning. The grandchildren's tuition is protected in their names, I said. It's you and my son who no longer have access to it, not them. She paused, recalibrated. Still, the message it sends to the kids. Let's talk about the message it sends, I said. Let's talk about the conversation you had with a real estate attorney about having me declared financially incompetent. The room changed. My son's wife, very carefully, did not look at my son. I was exploring options, she said after a moment. I was worried about your decision-making. You've been making some unusual moves with your assets, and I was concerned. What unusual moves? Another pause. The way you restructured your will last year. The way you've been... I'd like to hear specifically what concerned you, I said. She shifted in her chair. Harold, I don't see how relitigating all of this is productive. Then let's talk about something else. I picked up a single sheet of paper from the side table and held it out. She didn't take it, so I set it down on the coffee table facing her. That's a summary of the financial support I've provided to your household over the past 6 years. I went through it with my accountant. The total, including the down payment assistance, is just under $112,000. My son looked at the paper. I never kept a running tally, I said. I didn't give with the expectation of being repaid. I gave because my son needed help, and I was able to provide it. And I believed I was doing it within a relationship built on honesty. I looked at my daughter-in-law directly. But you want to talk about unusual decisions with my assets? $112,000. And you were quietly consulting attorneys about my competency. I'd like to understand that. You're twisting this, she said, but her voice had lost its earlier smoothness. Brianna, my son's voice, quiet and flat. She looked at him, and whatever she saw made her stop. I found the folder. She opened her mouth. The one in the car, he continued. The one with the attorney letterhead and the notes in your handwriting about the timeline for separating assets. I've had 4 days to read it and think about it, and I'd very much like you to explain it to me, because I've been trying to, and I can't make it add up in a way that means what I want it to mean. The silence stretched out long enough that I could hear the refrigerator humming from the kitchen. I was protecting myself, she said finally. The way things have been between you and your father, the way he's always inserting himself into our decisions, I didn't know how much longer we could sustain it. I needed to know what my options were. Your options for what? My son asked. She looked at the window. In case things didn't work out. And the business accounts? She went very still. Pete showed me the transaction records, my son said. His voice remained level, which I recognized as costing him something. 22 months of transfers. Small ones. Into an account I've never seen. I need you to tell me what that account is. My daughter-in-law was quiet for a moment that felt like it lasted much longer than it was. Then something in her posture changed. The practiced warmth fell away completely, and what was left was something harder and more honest than anything I'd seen from her in 6 years. I was building a safety net, she said, in case the marriage ended, in case your father finally convinced you to leave me. My father has never once suggested I leave you, my son said. He didn't have to suggest it directly. The way he looks at me, the way he makes me feel like I'm never enough for this family, like I'm always being measured against some standard I can't see. So you stole from our business, my son said. Not a question. I redirected funds to protect myself and our children. Brianna. He said her name once, quietly, like a period at the end of a very long sentence. She turned to me then, and her expression moved through several things before settling on something that was almost defiant. You want to know the truth, Harold? Yes. I pushed Connor to say what he said. I've been pushing it for years, little pieces at a time, because I needed him to see you as the obstacle instead of the support. Because as long as he was running to his father every time things got hard, I had no power in my own marriage. Was that wrong? Probably. But you sat in your perfect house with your perfect memories of his dead mother and made me feel like an outsider in my own family for 6 years. The room was very quiet. I looked at this woman, my son's wife, and I tried to find something I recognized. 6 years of Sunday dinners, Christmas mornings, sitting in the hospital waiting room when each grandchild was born. I had tried. I had genuinely tried, in ways she apparently had not seen or had chosen not to credit. I'm sorry you felt like an outsider, I said carefully. I am. If I contributed to that, I want to understand it. But what you just described is not a response to feeling excluded. What you just described is a campaign, years of it. Against me, against my son's ability to trust his own judgment, against the stability of people who never did anything to deserve it except love him. She looked away. You asked Connor to say something you knew would cause irreparable damage, I continued. Not in a moment of anger, with planning, with intent. I paused. That's not protecting yourself. That's choosing harm. My son stood up. He didn't say anything for a moment. He walked to the window, stood with his back to us both, and I could see from the set of his shoulders the specific weight of a man dismantling the version of his life he'd believed in. I need you to leave, he said finally. I couldn't tell at first who he was speaking to. Then he turned around, and he was looking at his wife. I need you to go home. Get the kids from your sister's place. I'll be there tonight. Her chin came up. Connor, I need to talk to my father. Alone. His voice was not unkind, but it was final. We'll talk at home. Later. She stood. She picked up her bag. At the door, she turned and gave me one long look that I could not fully read, and then she was gone. My son stood in the middle of my living room and pressed the heels of his hands against his eyes. Dad, he said, and it came out broken around the edges. I don't know where to start. You don't have to start anywhere today, I told him. I said, I know what you said. I meant to hurt you, his voice cracked. That's the part I can't get past. Whatever she fed me over the years, I still chose it. I picked that sentence out of everything I could have said, and I used it because I knew it would land. I thought for a moment about what to say. About the 25 years sitting behind us, heavy and real. About the morning he was born and the way Lena had looked at me across the hospital room like we had accomplished something neither of us fully deserved. About the terrible February when she died and the long road after it. Just the two of us finding our way through rooms that still smelled like her for months. You were 12 years old when your mother died, I said. And for a long time after that, you were angry. Not at me specifically, just at the whole shape of things, at what life had taken from you. And some of that anger found me because I was there to find. I understood that. I never held it against you. I looked at my son steadily. What happened in this kitchen last week was different. You're 37 years old, and you chose it. Those aren't the same thing. He nodded, eyes still closed. But here's what else is true, I said. I've made mistakes too. I worked more than I should have when you were young. Not because I didn't care, but because I didn't know another way to hold everything together, and I wasn't always smart enough to see what it looked like from your side. I paused. I should have said that out loud more. I assumed you knew. I was wrong to assume. He opened his eyes and looked at me. You want to know what a real father is? I said. A real father is a man who shows up every day for 25 years and doesn't require his son to be grateful for it. You don't owe me that. You never did. But I do need you to be honest with me, and I need you to be honest with yourself about what happened in this house and why. I know, he said quietly. That's where we start, I told him. Not with everything else. With that, he sat back down at the kitchen table, and I made a new pot of coffee, and we talked for 3 hours. Not about his wife, not about the business or the money or what came next. We talked about his mother, things he remembered, and things he'd only half remembered, and had never thought to ask me to fill in. We talked about the years I'd coached his baseball team, even though I was terrible at it. We talked about a trip we'd taken to Colorado when he was 15, just the two of us, before things got complicated. We talked about what kind of man he wanted to be, and what that required him to do starting Monday morning, when the harder work of all of this would still be waiting. At one point he said, I think I've known something was off for a while. With her, with us. I just kept choosing not to look directly at it. I told him I understood that too. At some point in the late afternoon, the light in the kitchen changed, and I realized we'd been sitting there for longer than I'd tracked. My son stood up to leave, and at the door he paused with his hand on the frame. Dad, he said, I'm sorry, all of it, but especially for the thing I said, because it wasn't true. It was never true. You were the most present person I've ever known, and I used the one thing I knew would undo that because I was scared and angry, and she had taught me to aim it at you. He met my eyes. I'll spend however long it takes making that right. Don't make it right with me, I said. Make it right with yourself. The rest will follow. He nodded once and walked to his car. I stood in the doorway and watched him drive away, and I thought about the word father and everything it contained. Not biology, not money, not the performance of sacrifice or the constant demonstration of investment. Something quieter and more durable than any of those things. The willingness to remain present to a person through every version of themselves, even the version that turned its most capable cruelty in your direction. I wasn't certain what the next months would look like. My son had decisions to make about his marriage, his business, his own accounting of what he'd participated in and what he'd allowed. Those were his to carry, and I would not carry them for him. The financial support I'd stopped would remain stopped for now, not as punishment, but because the circumstances that had made it appropriate no longer existed in the same form. I'd redirected the Children's Educational Fund, locked it away from everyone, including myself, until they were old enough to use it. Whatever happened between their parents, that would remain. Pete called me Monday evening to let me know that he and my son had begun a formal audit of the business accounts and had consulted an attorney about the discrepancies. He didn't ask me anything. He just wanted me to know. Frank came by on Tuesday with no lasagna and no pretense, just his coat and a thermos of decent coffee. And he sat at my kitchen table and said, You doing okay, Harry? The same way he'd said it the week before. This time I told him yes. and I meant it more completely. A week later, on a Friday evening when the light had gone low and the yard was covered in the first serious leaf fall of the season, I walked out to the garage and pulled out the box I'd been avoiding for 6 years. Lena's things, the ones I'd never been able to fully sort through. Letters, photographs, the small red notebook where she'd kept her garden plans each year, lists of seeds and bloom times in her careful handwriting. I'd kept them sealed because opening them had always felt like something I needed to be ready for, and I was never quite ready. But sitting in the garage, with the leaves coming down outside and the quiet of the house behind me, I realized I'd been waiting for a readiness that wasn't coming. The readiness was just the doing of it. I opened the box. I didn't find anything I didn't already know. I found her, the way she always showed up in the accumulated details of a life, in margin notes and grocery lists, and a photograph of the three of us at the beach in 1998, where my son was 7 years old, and sunburned and grinning so wide it took up half his face. She was laughing at something off camera, and I remembered exactly what it was, some terrible joke I'd made, and I held that photograph for a long time. I thought about what she would have made of all of it. Lena had been practical and unsentimental in the best possible way, with a directness that occasionally startled people who didn't know her well. She would have said that people reveal themselves when the pressure is high enough, and that what they reveal is always been there. She would have also said that what a person does after the revelation is the only part that actually counts. I put the photograph on the mantelpiece, where it had always belonged, and I went inside to start dinner. The house was quiet in the specific way I had come to recognize as honest quiet, rather than empty quiet. The quiet of a life that was mine, built on terms I understood without anyone else's revision running underneath it, like a current I couldn't account for. My son called that night, briefly. He was tired, he said. Things were in motion. He'd talk to me more over the weekend. I told him I'd be here. I meant it the same way I had always meant it, without conditions, without arithmetic, without the need to be thanked for the meaning of it. That was never what it was for. Before you go, subscribe and leave your thoughts in the comments below. I'd love to know what you think. And when you're ready, the next story is just one click away.